before the candle on the table had finished burning down to its second ring of wax, before the pianist in the corner had moved from the slow waltz to something faster, before the waiter had returned with the second bottle of wine no one had touched, a woman in a dove-gray dress reached across the table, picked up a full glass of red, and poured it slowly down the front of her own collarbone. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She watched her date for the reaction she had rehearsed for in the bathroom mirror an hour earlier. Across the dining room, a man whose name had appeared in 3 sealed police files before his 35th birthday slowly set down his fork. Because men like him were used to women performing beauty, not performing ruin. Even worse was what she whispered next, soft enough that only the table beside hers could hear. "I'm sorry. I'd rather be ugly to you than dead to him." Even the Don of the Vianello family could not look away. The restaurant was called Ostraca, and it sat on the 7th floor of a building that had once been a bank. The marble in the lobby was the original marble. The brass on the elevator panels was the original brass. The men who built the building had wanted you to feel small the moment you walked in, and 100 years later, the building still did its job. People who came to Ostraca did not come to eat. They came to be seen eating, which was a different kind of hunger, and a more expensive one. The dining room was lit by candles set in cut-glass holders along the center of every table, and by a single chandelier that hung from a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. The floor was black walnut, polished until it caught the candlelight and threw it back up in slow ripples whenever a waiter passed. The walls were painted a green so dark it read as black, until you stood close, and even then, you weren't sure. Along one wall, a row of arched windows looked out over the harbor district, where the lights of the cargo cranes blinked red and white against the late November sky. It was a Tuesday evening, the night the city's quietest power moved through its quietest rooms. On Tuesdays, the senators came in through the back. On Tuesdays, the judges took the corner booth. Ostraca did not advertise. It did not have a sign. It had a small brass plate beside the door that read only members and their guests, and the name of the restaurant existed on no menu, no website, and no map. The pianist was a man named Kovac who had been playing the same Steinway in that same corner for 19 years. He played whatever the room needed. When the room was loud, he played louder. When the room was tense, he played slower. Tonight the room was somewhere between, and so he was somewhere between, drifting through a Chopin nocturne that nobody requested and nobody complained about. The waiters wore black aprons that fell to their knees and did not speak unless spoken to. They moved between tables the way water moves between stones, finding the path of least resistance, leaving no wake behind them. They had been trained to never, under any circumstances, react to anything they saw. Which was why, when the woman in the dove-gray dress poured the entire glass of Barolo down her own chest, the waiter standing 6 feet behind her turned his face toward the wall and pretended to read the label on a bottle of mineral water for almost a full minute before he moved. The candle on table 11 kept burning. The pianist kept playing. The harbor lights kept blinking. And in a room full of people trained to look away, exactly one man was still looking. Her name was Henrika Vosburg, and she was a junior archivist at the city library, cataloging donated estate papers in a basement room with no windows and a single fluorescent light that hummed when it rained. She was 26 years old. The woman who had walked into Ostraca that evening was not the same woman who had walked out of the library at 5:15 the previous Friday, and she knew it, and she could not yet decide whether the difference was something that had been done to her, or something she had finally allowed herself to see. She was small. That was the first thing people noticed. Small in the way that suggested she had stopped growing earlier than she should have. Small in the way that made men in suits lean down when they spoke to her, and women in heels look over the tops of her head when they were searching for someone more important. Her hair was the color of wet sand, cut to her shoulders. and tonight it had been pinned back along the sides with two thin silver clips that her mother had given her on her 16th birthday, and that she had not worn since the funeral. Her eyes were a flat, patient blue, the kind of blue that did not reflect light so much as absorb it, and people who looked at her for too long sometimes felt as if they were the ones being read. The dress was not hers. The dress had been delivered to her apartment the previous afternoon in a long white box tied with a pale ribbon, with a card that said only, "Wear this. Be downstairs at 7." The dress was dove gray silk, cut on the bias, and it fit her exactly, which had frightened her more than anything else, because it meant someone had measured her from a distance. The shoes were also new. The earrings were also new. Even the small clutch bag on the chair beside her was new, and inside the clutch bag was a folded note she had read 17 times in the back of the car on the way to the restaurant, which said, "Do not embarrass us. He is not a patient man." She had spent 40 minutes in the bathroom of her apartment before the car arrived, staring at herself in the mirror, trying to decide who the woman in the dove gray dress was. She had practiced smiling. She had practiced laughing. She had practiced the small attentive tilt of the head that women in films used when men were speaking, and she had hated every version of herself she produced. And then, somewhere between the third and fourth attempt at the smile, she had understood what she was going to do. She was going to be unbearable. Not loud, not crude. She did not have the courage for crude. She was going to be the kind of unbearable that a man like the one waiting for her at Ostraca would not survive announcing to his associates, the kind of woman he would quietly, immediately, decide was not worth the trouble of acquiring. She would be strange. She would be inappropriate. She would say things at the wrong volume and laugh at things that were not funny, and pour wine on herself if she had to, and she would do it with a dead-eyed conviction that no man in that restaurant had ever seen on a woman who had been delivered to him in a dress he had paid for. It was the only plan she had. She had not slept the night before. She had not eaten that morning. She had taken the bus to her brother's group home at noon and sat with him for an hour while he showed her the new puzzle the staff had given him, a 400-piece picture of a lighthouse, and she had held his hand and told him she loved him and not told him anything else. Because her brother Wim was 19 years old, with the mind of a 6-year-old, and the only thing in the world that could make Wim cry harder than a stranger raising their voice was the suspicion that his sister was sad. She had not been sad in front of Wim. That was the rule. She had never been sad in front of Wim. Not when their mother died. Not when their father vanished 6 months later. Not when she had taken legal guardianship of him at 22 and learned what the words unfit medical placement meant when they came out of a state caseworker's mouth. She had braided his hair before she left. He liked it braided. She had kissed his forehead. She had told him she would see him on Sunday. She had not told him about the man at Ostraca. She had not told him about the dress. She had not told him about the debt. The debt was not hers. That was the part she had to keep reminding herself over and over in the small hours of the night when shame tried to climb into her bed and lie down beside her like a second body. The debt was not hers. The debt belonged to her father, a man named Albrecht Vosburg, who had walked out of their apartment on a Sunday morning 6.5 years ago, wearing his good coat and carrying a leather satchel that Henrika had not been allowed to look inside, and who had not come back. He had left a note on the kitchen counter. The note said, "I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry." He had written the words 3 times because the first 2 times had not been enough, and apparently the third time had not been either, because the note had also said, "Tell Wim his father had to go away to be a better man. Tell him I will come home when I am better." He had not come home. He had not become better. What he had become, Henrika learned over the years that followed, was a man who borrowed money from people you did not borrow money from, and who eventually disappeared into a country whose name Henrika still could not say without feeling something cold move through her chest. The first letter had arrived 11 months ago. It had been hand-delivered to her apartment by a man in a charcoal coat who had not knocked, but had simply slid the envelope under her door and walked away down the stairwell without a sound. The letter was typed on heavy cream paper. It used her father's full name. It used her brother's full name. It used the address of the group home where Wim lived, and the name of the night nurse who worked Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the make and model of the car the day shift caseworker drove. It did not threaten anyone. It did not need to. The letter said only that her father had borrowed a sum of money from a private lender named Costanzo Vianello, that the sum had not been repaid, that the interest had compounded, and that the family had elected, in light of the unfortunate circumstances, to consider alternative forms of settlement. She had not understood what alternative forms of settlement meant until the second letter arrived, 3 weeks later. The second letter had been shorter. The second letter had said only a meeting will be arranged. You will be informed. The third letter, 4 months after that, had named the restaurant. She had gone to the police. That had been her first mistake. The detective who took her statement had been kind in the way that people are kind when they are about to tell you they cannot help you. He had written down the name Vianello. He had set the pen down. He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said, very quietly, that the family had been operating in the city for 4 generations, that 2 of his colleagues had retired early after opening files with that name on them, and that his sincere advice, off the record, was that she find a way to settle the matter privately. She had walked out of the precinct and sat on the steps for almost an hour, watching cars pass on the wet street, and she had understood for the first time that there were rooms in this city she could not enter and rooms she could not leave, and that she had just discovered which kind of room she was in. She had tried other things. She had called her father's last known number, which had been disconnected for years. She had gone to the bank, where a sympathetic loan officer had explained that no institution in the country would lend her the sum named in the letter. She had written to her mother's cousin in another city, and the letter had come back unopened, marked refused. She had considered running. She had considered taking Wim and getting on a bus and going somewhere the letters could not find them. But Wim could not handle change. Wim had lived in the same group home for 6 years. Wim knew the names of all the staff, the route of his weekly van trip, the brand of yogurt the kitchen kept in the second refrigerator. Take Wim out of that place, and within a week, he would stop sleeping. Henrika had seen it happen once, and she had promised herself she would never do that to him again, no matter what it cost her. It had cost her this. The fourth letter had come on a Wednesday. It had contained the dress measurements. It had contained the address of the boutique where the dress would be sent from. It had contained the date and the time, and at the bottom, in a different hand, in ink that looked blue-black under the kitchen light, someone had written, "Be agreeable. He chooses quickly." She had read those last 4 words 100 times. He chooses quickly. And somewhere between the 4th reading and the 14th, sitting at her kitchen table at 2 o'clock in the morning with the letter flat in front of her and a cup of tea going cold beside it, Henrika Vosberg had decided that if a man was going to choose quickly, she was going to make sure he chose someone else. She would not be agreeable. She would be the worst woman in the room. It was not a plan. It was barely even a strategy. It was the only thing she had left that no one else could take from her, the right to be unwanted on her own terms. The man across the table was not Costanzo Vianello. That was the first thing she had registered when the maitre d' had walked her to the table at 7:03 and pulled out the chair across from a stranger she had never seen in any of the photographs the detective had quietly slid across his desk. The man across from her was younger than Costanzo would have been, mid-40s at most, with thick, dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, a jaw that had been broken at least once and had healed in a way that gave it a slight asymmetry, and eyes the color of weak coffee. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way armor fits a soldier, without vanity, without fuss, only function. He wore no jewelry except a thin silver band on his right ring finger, on the wrong hand for a wedding, on the wrong finger for fashion. He had stood when she approached. He had not smiled. He had said only, "Miss Vosburgh, please." His name, she would later learn, was Leander Vianello. He was Costanzo's nephew, and he was the Don's chosen successor, and he was the man to whom her father's debt had been transferred 11 months ago, when Costanzo's heart had begun to fail, and the family had begun the quiet work of rearranging itself for the next generation. The dress had not been sent by Costanzo. The letters had not been signed by Costanzo. The man who would choose quickly tonight was the man across from her, and Henrique, looking at him in the candlelight, had understood within the first 15 seconds that she had badly misjudged the kind of man he was going to be. He was not flamboyant. He was not loud. He had the stillness of a man who had no need to perform power, because everyone in the room already knew. 2 waiters had bowed to him. The maitre d' had not spoken above a whisper. Even the pianist had glanced up from the keys when Leander Vianello had entered the dining room, and had not glanced up once for anyone else all evening. She had sat down. She had ordered a glass of wine she did not intend to drink. She had begun the performance. She had laughed too loudly at the wrong moments. She had asked him questions about his work, and then interrupted his answers. She had taken a piece of bread from the basket and torn it apart with her hands and let the crumbs fall on the tablecloth without acknowledging them. She had told him, when he asked what she did for a living, that she sorted dead people's mail for a living, and she had said it with a small, bright smile, the way you might announce that you bred horses. She had watched his face for the flinch. The flinch had not come. He had looked at her, quietly, patiently. The way a man looks at a chessboard after his opponent has made a move he had not anticipated but is not displeased to see. He had reached for his water glass and taken a small sip and set it down and said, evenly, "That is an unusual way to put it." And she had understood in that moment that the performance was not working. So she had reached for the wine. She had picked up the full glass of Barolo. She had poured it down the front of her own dress, slowly, deliberately, watching his eyes the entire time. And then, because her courage had finally arrived in full, 15 seconds too late to be useful, she had whispered the truth. "I'm sorry. I'd rather be ugly to you than dead to him." She had not meant to say it. The truth had been sitting at the base of her throat all evening, and the wine had loosened something. And the way he was looking at her, not angry, not amused, but attentive, the way a man listens to a sound he cannot yet identify, had broken the small, tight knot of her control. She braced for the cold rise of his voice. She braced for the signal he would give the maitre d'. She braced for the car ride home and the next letter and whatever it was that came after. He did not raise his voice. He set down his fork. He looked at her for a long, slow count of 3, and then, in a tone so quiet it barely cleared the candle between them, he said, "Who is going to kill you, Miss Vosburgh?" He should not have asked the question. That was the thought that arrived in Leander Vianello's mind a half-second after the words left his mouth, and it arrived with the weary, familiar tone of a thought that had been arriving in his head for almost 30 years. He did not move when the thought came. He had trained himself, over a long career of being watched by people who were waiting for him to flinch, never to move when his own thoughts arrived. He simply held her gaze across the candle and waited to see what she would do with the question, because the question was already on the table now, and he was a man who did not unsay things. She had gone very still. The wine was still soaking through the front of her dress, a dark blossom spreading slowly toward her waist, and she had not yet looked down at it. Her hands were on the edge of the table, Her knuckles were white. Her eyes, which he had registered earlier as a flat, patient blue, had widened by perhaps a tenth of an inch. And that tenth of an inch had told him everything he had needed to know. She had not been performing rudeness. She had been performing a different woman, and the woman she had been performing was a woman she thought he wanted to throw away, which meant somewhere, behind her, was a thing she was running from that was worse than him. And Leander Vianello, who had been the worst thing in many rooms, was not in the habit of being outranked. He had recognized, the moment the wine had gone down the front of her dress, the specific quality of a person who has run out of options and is performing destruction as a last resort, because the only thing left to control is how badly the thing arrives. He had seen that performance once before, in the face of a girl named Maren Aldewick, 28 years ago, in a kitchen on the third floor of a building that no longer existed. He had been 17. Maren had been 16. She had been the daughter of a baker on the same street where his uncle's family kept a row of warehouses, and she had been the first person Leander had ever loved in the inarticulate, unbearable way that boys love at 17. He had loved her for the better part of a year, in secret, because his uncle had already begun the work of arranging Leander's life for the family's purposes, and Maren's father had already begun the work of arranging Maren's life for his own, which involved a debt of his own, and a man named Heller from the docks, who had agreed to forgive the debt in exchange for the daughter. Leander had known about the arrangement. Maren had told him. They had sat on the back stairs of the bakery on a Thursday night in October, and she had told him that she was being married in 3 weeks to a man who was 41 years old and who had, the previous summer, beaten a man to death behind a tavern for an insult that no witness could later remember. She had told him this with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward the alley, because she could not say it while looking at him. He had told her he would fix it. He had been 17. He had believed he could fix things. He had gone to his uncle the next morning and asked, in the careful, formal language his uncle preferred, whether the family might be willing to absorb the baker's debt. His uncle had looked at him for a long time across the desk and had said, in the same even tone Leander himself would inherit 20 years later, that the family did not absorb debts owed to men who were not friends of the family, and that the baker's daughter was not a matter of family business, and that Leander would be wise to remember that the world contained women, plural, and that he had not yet developed the judgment to distinguish between a woman and a feeling. Leander had not gone back to Maren. He had not gone back because he had been 17, and his uncle had been the only father he had ever known, and the word judgment had landed in his chest like a hook, and he had thought, in the awful self-protective logic of 17-year-old boys, that perhaps his uncle was right. Maren had been married on a Sunday in November. Leander had not attended. He had heard, through a cousin, that she had walked out of the church on Heller's arm without looking up from the stones. She had lived 11 months. The story the family told afterward had been a story about stairs. The story the dock workers told had been a different story. Leander had not asked which story was true. He had carried her for 28 years. He had carried her into rooms where men had begged him for their lives, and into rooms where his own uncle had died with Leander's hand on his shoulder, and into every Tuesday dinner at Ostraca for the past 9 years, where men brought him women to be chosen and he chose none of them, because choosing one would mean closing a door he had kept open on the small chance that the universe would one day deliver him a second opportunity to do the thing he had not done at 17. He had stopped believing the universe was in the habit of doing that. And then a small woman in a dove-gray dress had poured a glass of Barolo down the front of her own collarbone in a restaurant where no one had ever, in the building's 100-year history, done such a thing, and had whispered across the table that she would rather be ugly to him than dead to someone else. He set down his fork. He looked at her. He asked the question, and he understood, watching her hands tighten on the edge of the table that the universe had finally answered. She did not answer the question. She could not answer the question, because answering the question meant saying his uncle's name out loud in a restaurant, his uncle's name owned, and she had spent 11 months learning that some words, spoken in the wrong rooms, became weapons that turned in the hand of the speaker. So she stayed silent. She kept her hands on the edge of the table. She watched the candle between them and waited for whatever was going to happen next to happen. Leander Vianello did not press. He had sat across from enough frightened people in his life to know the difference between a silence that was hiding something and a silence that was protecting something, and the woman across from him was protecting. He waited a slow count of 10. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a small black notebook and a fountain pen, and he wrote 3 words on a clean page, tore the page out along the perforation, folded it once, and slid it across the table to her without comment. She did not pick it up. She looked at the folded paper the way a person looks at a closed door in a hallway she had not known existed. "Read it," he said, "and then decide." She unfolded the paper. The 3 words on the page were, "I already know." She read them twice. Then she read them a 3rd time, because the first 2 readings had made no sense to her, and the 3rd reading made too much sense, and she understood with a cold, small clarity that arrived behind her sternum and spread outward, that this man had known who she was before she had walked into the restaurant. He had known the name of the debt. He had known the name of the man it had been owed to. He had been sitting at this table for the last 40 minutes, letting her perform a stranger, because he had wanted to see what kind of woman she was when she believed her life depended on being unwanted. She set the paper down. "Then why?" she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "Did you let me pour wine on myself? Because I needed to know if you were brave or only desperate. And which am I?" He looked at her. "Both," he said, "which is the only useful combination." The waiter approached the table with the kind of careful peripheral motion that staff at Ostraca had developed for situations they were trained not to interrupt. Leander raised one finger, barely, without looking. The waiter retreated. "Miss Vosberg," Leander said, "I am going to say 4 things, and I am going to say them only once, and then I am going to ask you to choose. Do you understand me?" She nodded. She did not trust her voice. 1. Your father's debt is no longer your father's debt. It was transferred to me 11 months ago, and as of this moment, sitting at this table, I am declaring it settled. There is no balance. There will be no further letters. She opened her mouth. He held up his hand. She closed her mouth. 2. The arrangement you were brought here to enter does not exist. There is no arrangement. There was never going to be an arrangement. The dinner was, on my part, a meeting. On the part of the people who delivered you here, it was something else. And we will address that separately, and you will not be involved in addressing it. The candle between them guttered once. Neither of them looked at it. 3. Your brother is safe. He has been safe since the moment you walked into this room, because 2 of my people have been at the group home since 6 o'clock this evening, and they will remain there tonight, and tomorrow, and every night after that, for as long as it takes me to be certain that no one who has been watching him stops watching him on my schedule rather than theirs. Her hand on the edge of the table began to shake. 4. You owe me nothing for any of this. Not gratitude, not your time, not your company. You may stand up from this table when I finish speaking and walk to the elevator and never see me again, and the first 3 things I have just told you will remain true. Do you understand? She could not speak. She nodded. Then choose, he said. She did not stand up. She sat in the chair across from him for a long time, with her hands in her lap and the wine drying slowly into the silk of the dress, and she tried to make her mind do the thing it was supposed to do, which was assess. She had become, in the last 11 months, A person who assessed the exits in every room she entered, and now her mind was failing to assess anything at all. It was simply sitting in her skull, breathing, the way a small animal breathes when it has been picked up by something larger than itself and is waiting to learn whether it is going to be eaten or set down. Leander did not rush her. He folded the small black notebook and returned it to his inside pocket. He returned the pen. He looked at the candle. He waited. After what might have been a minute or might have been 5, she said, very quietly, "Why?" He had been expecting the question since the moment he set down his fork. "Because I knew a girl once," he said, "whose father owed money to a man, and whose father did not pay, and who walked into a marriage she had not chosen, because no one with the power to stop it stopped it. And one of the people who did not stop it was me. I was 17. I have been 17, in a small room in the back of my own head, every day since." He did not look at her while he said this. He looked at the candle. She was not given the chance to pour wine on herself, Miss Vosberg. She did not get to choose how she arrived at the table. I did not give her that chance, and the man she was given to did not give her that chance, and her father did not give her that chance. And she lived 11 months after the wedding, and she did not live an hour longer. The candle between them moved very slightly in some draft no one could feel. "When you walked into this restaurant tonight," he said, "I had already decided what I was going to do. I was going to declare the debt settled. I was going to send you home. That was the plan I had made before you sat down." He looked up. "And then you poured wine on yourself." She was crying. She had not realized she was crying. The tears were moving down her face without sound, the way tears move when a person has been holding them for so long that their body has forgotten how to make the noise that should accompany them. "I changed my plan," he said, "because I have spent 28 years looking for a woman who was about to be erased and being too late, and tonight, for the first time, I was on time. The only way I do not waste that is if you tell me, now, with the door still open behind you, what you actually need. Not what you think you are allowed to ask for. What you need." She could not answer for a long time. When she did, the words came in the wrong order. The way words come when a person has been silent for 11 months and has not practiced any of the necessary sentences. She told him about Wim. She told him the lighthouse puzzle. She told him about the night nurse on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She told him about the apartment, the basement room at the library, the fluorescent light that hummed when it rained. She told him about the first letter, the second letter, and the third. She told him about the detective on the precinct steps. She told him about her father's note, the 3 apologies, the satchel he had not been allowed to look inside. She told him about her mother's funeral and the silver clips and the fact that she had not worn them since. She told him that she had not eaten a sit-down meal in 11 months, that she had been losing fistfuls of hair in the shower for 6 months and had stopped looking at the drain. She told him that she had taken legal guardianship of her brother at 22, and that she had been afraid every single day since that someone with a clipboard would decide she was not enough, that she would lose him to the state, and that she had built her entire adult life around the project of not losing him. She told him that she had practiced being unbearable in a bathroom mirror for 40 minutes that afternoon, and she had not been very good at it, and she was sorry about the wine. He did not interrupt. He did not nod. He did not reach for her hand. He sat with his own hands flat on the table and let her speak, and when she had stopped speaking, he waited a long count to be sure she was finished. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." He took out the notebook again. He wrote one line on a clean page and tore it out and slid it across to her. The line said, "Albin Holdgrave, attorney. He will call you tomorrow at 9. He handles families," Leander said. "Guardianship, conservatorship, protective filings, and 4 other things you are about to learn the names of. He has been the family's attorney for 16 years, and he is, separately, the best family lawyer in the state. As of tomorrow morning, he is yours." She looked at the name on the paper. The handwriting was small, careful, and very even. "And you," she said. "What about me? What do you want?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I want you to eat the dinner you ordered," he said. "And I want you to let me drive you home. And I want you to sleep in your apartment tonight knowing that no one is coming to your door. And I want you to call Albin in the morning. And I want, after that, for you to decide what you want. Not before. Not at this table. Not in this dress. After." She picked up her fork. She ate. He drove her home himself. She had expected a car with a driver. She had expected, in some smaller, more cynical part of her, a hotel. What she had not expected was for Leander Vianello to ask the valet to bring around a dark green sedan with a small dent in the rear bumper, to open the passenger door for her himself, to close it behind her with the soft, deliberate click of a man who had been raised to close doors that way, and to drive across the city at exactly the speed limit while she sat beside him, with the wine drying on her dress and the city sliding past the window in long ribbons of yellow light. He did not speak for most of the drive. He played no music. He asked her once if the heat in the car was warm enough. She said yes. He nodded. When they arrived at her building, he did not get out of the car. He put the car in park and turned slightly toward her, his hand still on the wheel, and said, "2 of my people will be in the lobby of your building tonight. 2 more on your floor. You will not see them unless you need to. They will be there until Albin and I have arranged something more permanent." She nodded. She did not have a question that was the right size for the moment. "Miss Vosberg?" "Yes. Eat something tomorrow morning, before you call Albin. He will have a great deal to say, and you will need to be able to hear him." "Yes. Good night." "Good night." She got out of the car. She walked up the steps of her building, past the 2 strangers in the lobby who did not look at her, but whose presence she registered the way a person registers a wall that has not been there before, and she rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and she walked down the hallway to apartment 4C, and she unlocked her door, and she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her, and she turned the deadbolt. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was a sound she had been hearing for 6.5 years. It had never, until that exact second, been the sound of safety. She stood in the entryway of her apartment with her back against the door and her hand still on the deadbolt, and she did not move for a long time. The kitchen light was on. The kettle was on the stove where she had left it that morning. The folded newspaper was on the table. The cup with the cold tea was beside the newspaper. The letter, the 4th letter, was still on the counter where she had left it, weighted down at one corner by a salt shaker. She walked to the counter. She picked up the letter. She read the 4 words at the bottom one more time. "Be agreeable. He chooses quickly." She walked to the sink. She turned on the faucet. She held the letter under the running water until the ink began to bleed, until the heavy cream paper began to soften, until the words she had read 100 times became gray and indistinct, and finally, no words at all. She crumpled the wet paper in her fist. She walked to the trash can. She dropped it in. And then her legs went out from under her. She did not fall, exactly. She sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, and she pulled her knees up to her chest, and she put her forehead on her knees, and she made a sound that was not quite crying, and not quite laughing, and not quite either. A sound that came from a place in her chest that had been locked for 11 months, and had not been opened since the first letter had slid under her door. The wine on her dress was cold now. The kitchen tile was cold. The whole apartment was cold, because she had not turned the heat up before she left, because she had not been certain she was coming back. When she could breathe again, she stood up. She walked to the bathroom. She turned on the shower. She let the dove-gray dress fall off her shoulders and onto the floor in a wet, heavy heap, and she stepped under the water, and she stood there until the water ran clear at her feet, and then she stood there longer. When she came out, the apartment was warmer. Someone, she would learn the next morning, had quietly turned up the thermostat from the hallway control box. She slept. She slept lying down. She slept all the way through the night. She slept the way a person sleeps when they have stopped, for the first time in 11 months, listening for footsteps. Albin Holdgrave called at 8:58. He apologized for being 2 minutes early. He had been raised by a mother, he said, who considered punctuality the only virtue available to people who could not afford the others, and he hoped Miss Vosberg would forgive him. She would forgive him. She would forgive Albin Holdgrave for almost anything in the weeks that followed, because Albin Holdgrave was the first man in 11 months who had spoken to her about her own life, as if her own life were a thing that could be managed, repaired, and quietly defended. He was 62 years old. He had a voice like dry paper. He had raised 3 daughters of his own and buried a wife 8 years ago, and he had made the practice of family law into a kind of slow, methodical priesthood that did not leave much room for performance. He had 3 things he would like to begin that morning. The first was the guardianship file. He had reviewed her brother's case overnight. He had identified 4 small irregularities in the original placement paperwork, none of them her fault, all of them quietly correctable, and he was going to correct them by the end of the week. He was also going to convert her temporary guardianship, which had been renewed annually for 4 years and could in theory be challenged by any ambitious caseworker with a grievance, into a permanent conservatorship with full medical and residential authority. This would take approximately 90 days. After 90 days, he said, no one with a clipboard would be able to take Wim away from her. Ever, under any circumstances. Did she understand? She understood. The second thing was a protective filing. He had drafted, overnight, a sealed petition naming 3 individuals, 2 of whom had hand-delivered the letters, 1 of whom had signed the line at the bottom of the 4th letter in blue-black ink. The petition was being filed in chambers that morning before a Judge Albin had appeared before for 16 years. It would be granted. The 3 individuals would be served by the end of the day. They would not contact her again. They would not contact her brother. They would not contact the group home, the library, her landlord, or her neighbors. If they did, they would be in violation of a court order, and the consequences of that violation would not be his problem to administer. Did she understand? She understood that too. The third thing was a financial reorganization. Mr. Vianello had instructed Albin to establish a small, irrevocable trust in her brother's name, funded sufficiently to cover his current placement and care for the remainder of his natural life, indexed for inflation, with a corporate trustee selected by Albin's firm and an independent oversight provision so that no single party, including Mr. Vianello, including any future Mr. Vianello, including Albin himself, could alter the terms unilaterally. The trust would close the question of Wim's care permanently. Did she understand? She did not immediately understand. She asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. She sat on the edge of her bed in her bathrobe with the phone pressed against her ear, and she looked at the wall for a long time, and she said, very carefully, Mr. Holdgrave, I cannot accept that. Miss Vosberg, he said, with respect, you can. The trust is for your brother. It is not for you. You are not its beneficiary, and you have no authority to refuse it on his behalf, because the standard the court will apply is his interest, not yours. If you would like to refuse on principle, you may, but the principle will lose. I have done this for 16 years. The principle always loses to the boy. She did not answer. Mr. Vianello anticipated this objection. Albin continued. He asked me to tell you that he was not asking your permission. He was informing you of a decision he had made about a person he had decided was his responsibility. He suggested that if the decision troubled you, you were welcome to be troubled by it for as long as you needed, but that he would not be revisiting it. She closed her eyes. "All right," she said. "All right," Albin agreed. The two men outside her apartment did not leave on the third day, or the fourth, or the seventh. On the eighth day, one of them knocked on her door in the late afternoon, very politely, and introduced himself as Felix, and informed her that a young woman named Dorothy would be arriving the following morning. Dorothy was a domestic violence advocate who had worked with Mr. Holdgrave's office for 9 years, and the resources, Felix explained, were the same. Dorothy arrived at 10 the next morning with a leather folder and a soft voice, and a small box of pastries from a bakery Henrika had never heard of. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. By the end of the second hour, Henrika had a calendar. She had a list of names. She had a number to call if she could not sleep. She had the address of a counselor who specialized in adult survivors of long-term coercion, and an appointment for the following Tuesday, and a small folded card with a phone number on it that Dorothy said was for emergencies of any kind, day or night, and that no one would ask her to justify the call. She had, for the first time in 11 months, a list of things to do that did not involve surviving the next letter. Spring arrived late that year. It arrived in the second week of April, all at once, with a wind that shifted in a single afternoon and a sky that had been gray since November and was suddenly, inexplicably, the color of a washed bowl. The ice melted out of the gutters. The cargo cranes along the harbor district lost their winter coat of frost. The maples along Henriquez Street, which she had walked past every morning for 4 years without noticing, put out their first soft red buds, and Henrika, walking to the bus stop with a thermos of coffee in one hand and her library badge in the other, stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the branches for almost a full minute, because she had not, she realized, looked up at anything in a long time. She had been moved out of the basement room in February. Albin had, without asking her, mentioned to the head of acquisitions over a charity lunch that Miss Vosberg's qualifications were being underused, and the head of acquisitions had, the following Monday, offered her a position on the third floor cataloging rare manuscripts in a room with 2 windows and an oak table and a brass lamp that did not hum when it rained. The pay was $41,000, $4,000 more than she had been making. She had accepted. She had not asked Albin whether the lunch had been a coincidence, because by February she had stopped asking that kind of question. Wim was thriving. Wim was thriving in the small, sturdy way he always thrived when nothing was changing. The same staff, the same yogurt, the same Tuesday van trip. But with a new addition, which was that twice a month, on Saturdays, a tall, quiet man named Felix arrived at the group home in a dark green sedan with a small dent in the rear bumper, and took Wim and Henrike to a diner at the edge of the harbor where the pancakes were the size of dinner plates. Felix did not speak much. Wim adored him. Felix had figured out, somewhere around the third visit, that Wim liked it when adults answered his questions seriously, no matter how many times he asked the same question, and Felix answered the same 6 questions about ships, lighthouses, and the speed of light every other Saturday with the same unhurried gravity, as if hearing each question for the first time. The conservatorship was approved on a Thursday in March. Albin called her from the courthouse steps. He said, "It is done, Miss Vosberg," and she had to sit down on the floor of the third-floor reading room for a moment before she could answer him. The 4th letter, which she had washed out in the sink, never had a 5th or a 6th. The 3 names in the sealed petition vanished from her life as completely as if they had never been written. There was a thing Felix had said to her once, very briefly, while they were waiting for Wim to come down the steps of the group home, which was, "Some people leave the city, Miss Vosberg. Some people decide on their own. It is better not to think about which." She had not thought about which. In May, she bought a small potted lemon tree and put it on the kitchen windowsill. The tree produced one impossibly small green lemon, which never ripened, but which she watered every morning anyway, because the tree did not know it had failed, and she did not have the heart to tell it. She slept lying down every night. She had not, in 7 months, once put her hand on the deadbolt without remembering that the deadbolt now belonged, fully and finally, to her. She saw him once more. It was late October, almost a year to the day from the night at Ostraca, and she had taken Wim to the harbor for the lighting of the autumn lanterns, a small civic event that the city held every year on the last Friday of the month, in which the cargo cranes were strung with paper lanterns, and the harbor master rang the old shipping bell at sundown, and children threw folded paper boats into the dark water and watched them drift out toward the breakwater under the lights. Wim had folded 3 boats. He had spent 40 minutes on each one. He was very serious about the creases. They were standing at the railing watching the 3rd boat drift away from the pier when Henrika happened to look up and across the small crowd and saw him. He was standing alone at the far end of the pier, his hands in the pockets of a charcoal coat she remembered, the silver at his temples a little brighter under the lantern light than it had been a year ago. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the water. He had, perhaps, come to see the lanterns himself, the way people do small civic things alone when they have run out of other places to put their evenings. He turned his head slightly, the way a person turns their head when they have felt themselves observed, and their eyes met across the crowd. He did not wave. He did not move toward her. He inclined his head, very slightly, the small precise inclination of a man acknowledging a person he does not need to greet, because the greeting has already happened, a year ago, in a different building, with a candle between them. She inclined her head back. That was all. He turned and walked down the pier in the other direction, his coat moving in the harbor wind, and within a minute he was gone among the lanterns, and the harbor master rang the bell, and Wim tugged at her sleeve to ask whether his 3rd boat had reached the breakwater yet, and Henrika looked down at her brother and said, "Yes, Wim. It made it. They all made it." She did not look back toward the end of the pier. She did not need to. Somewhere in the city, in a small back room of a house that had been in the same family for 4 generations, a man who had been 17 years old in a kitchen on a 3rd floor for 28 years finally stopped being 17 and walked, for the first time in his adult life, into the rest of his evening as a man of his current age. The lanterns burned on the cranes until midnight. The boats drifted out past the breakwater. The deadbolt in apartment 4C waited faithfully in its locked position for the hand that now belonged, fully and finally, to it.